Hello everyone, welcome back to another true crime dish. We took a little bit of an unexpected break, but we are back today and we're going to be making some pasta because that's what I was craving and I am a hoe for some pasta. And I'm also going to be telling you guys about a very rough but interesting case. So trigger warning, this case does include sexual assault, grooming, kidnapping, all of that. So if that's something that triggers you, you're not interested in, then just skip over this video. With that being said, we are going to be discussing the case of Franklin Delano Floyd today. It's March of 1995 and a mechanic down in Texas goes to a car auction. He's looking, for a new car, and he is browsing around and he sees a truck that he likes, and so he knows that it's going to be a little bit of a fixer-upper, but he purchases it, takes it home. He starts inspecting it to see what kind of work needs to be done on it. And upon inspecting it, he comes across a mysterious manila envelope that's taped above the gas tank. And so he opens it up and he is horrified to find a stack of about 100 photos that contain sexually explicit photos of young children as well as abused women, and there are even some photos of a woman that looks like she's already dead. Obviously shocked by this discovery, he reaches out to the police, thank God, and he didn't know it at the time, but this mechanic's discovery would end up unraveling the dark secrets and many crimes of Franklin Delano Floyd. Franklin Delano Floyd was born June 17th, 1943 in Barnesville, Georgia. He was the youngest of 5 children to his parents Thomas and Della. And unfortunately, Franklin's father, Thomas, would pass away when Franklin was only about 1 year old. His father lived a life of alcoholism and ultimately died of kidney and liver failure at the young age of 32 years old. So he passed away, unfortunately, and that left Della to care for these 5 young children all on her own. So Della was 29 years old, had 5 young children, no idea what to really do. So she reaches out to her parents and they allow Della and her kids to come live with them for a little bit, but that would only last about a year. It became too much for Della's parents and they subsequently ended up kicking the family out, and it was just too much for all of them. And Della felt very helpless even still at this point. I mean, that's a lot to handle on your own. So she ended up turning the kids over to a children's home because she just couldn't care for all of them. It was at this children's home that Franklin would have a very rough go of it. He did not have a good time here. He was only about 3 or 4 years old when he was put into the home, but he was bullied quite a bit when he was there. A lot of the other kids would make fun of him for being too feminine, which is so fucked up, obviously, but it's like, also this is the 40s, so like, people were not very open-minded back then, unfortunately, but I'm also like, this kid is 3. Leave him alone. And this part is rough, but when he was just 6 years old, he would be sexually assaulted with a broomstick. And I do really feel bad for the child version of Franklin. I mean, obviously this guy ends up being like the worst human in the world, but when he's a child, I do feel bad for him because, I mean, you're 6 years old. Like, there's no adult there that's paying any attention to you to help you. Like, you're completely defenseless and vulnerable. So life was not off to a good start for Franklin, to say the least. By the time all of Franklin's siblings were each turning 18, they were like, peace out, we're getting the f out, leaving Franklin all by himself. If you remember, he's the youngest of 5, so they just kind of ditched him there. And I mean, it sounds like a horrible place that they were, so don't blame them for leaving, obviously. But Franklin was 16, he ran away from the home and he broke into a house nearby just to steal some food. He was often getting in trouble for stealing and fighting and things like that, clearly retaliating, like he had no one paying attention to him. And in this case, I mean, he sounds like he was just hungry. So he broke into that nearby home. The children's home found out about this and they reached out to one of Franklin's older sisters and said, hey, you need to come get your brother and take guardianship of him. If you don't, then charges are going to be pressed against him. So she kind of felt like she didn't really have a choice. She had moved off and started her own family. She had a husband. She was very reluctant to let Franklin into their household, but she did allow him to stay with her and her family for about a year. And after a year, she had had enough and she kicked him out. So Franklin was homeless now, but he at least didn't have to return to the children's home. So with nowhere to really go, he decided that he was going to go look for his mother. At this point, it had been over 10 years since he had seen her last. He starts heading towards Indianapolis, where he suspects that she is, but when he gets there, he does find her, but he finds that she has turned to a life of sex work. She and Franklin both kind of realized that she still couldn't care for Franklin, so she couldn't do much for him, but Franklin decided that he wanted to join the army, so he had her help forging some documents because he's 16 at this point, so he is underage. So he had her help forge some documents so that he could at least enlist in the army. So he moves out to California, enlists in the army, and he serves for about 6 months, but after that 6 months, the army discovers that all of his documents had been falsified, and so they discharged him. After he was discharged, he tried to find his mom again, but he couldn't find her anywhere, so he reverted back to a life of theft and just kind of became a drifter, moving all over the state of California. After he was discharged from the army, things just got weird. I guess maybe that was like the last straw for him. I feel like that was maybe his effort to try to do something good in this world, and it backfired on him, so I feel like at this point he was just like, whatever. In 1960, Floyd tries to steal a gun from Sears, you know, the department store Sears, which when I read that I was like, hold on. Like, are we talking about the same Sears? The Sears that I used to go to get my family portraits done at? They used to sell weapons? I had no idea. Did not know that. He tries to steal a gun from there. The burglar alarm goes off. The cops are notified. They rush over to the Sears. Franklin gets in a shootout with the cops, and the police end up shooting Franklin in the stomach, and he has to be taken to the hospital to have life-saving measures performed, but unfortunately, he survived. For that whole debacle, he was sentenced to a year in prison. So then in 1962, he's released, and he moves back to Georgia. He gets a job at the Atlanta airport, and so you're thinking, okay, maybe things are turning around. He went to prison for a year, maybe things are going to get better. No. They're not. They're going to get significantly worse. Not long after moving back to Atlanta, he abducts a 4-year-old little girl from a bowling alley and takes her into the woods and sexually assaults her. Yeah. This guy is a actual monster. Luckily, he does get caught, and he is charged with kidnapping and child molestation and is sentenced to 10 to 12 years in prison. But after only about a year or two of being in prison, Franklin goes out on a medical errand and he manages to escape. He escapes, and then he immediately robs a bank for $6,000 and gets caught again. Like, this guy is just an idiot. For somebody that's like actually a career criminal, you're not very good at it. Like, hello, justice system. This is not this guy's first offense. He escaped from prison, robbed a bank immediately upon escaping, and then he was put back in prison. Hello, this guy is clearly going to continue to reoffend, and he doesn't give a shit. He was taken back to prison where he tried to escape again, and this time he failed. He was caught. So as punishment, they moved him to another institution in Pennsylvania, and he was not going to have a good time there. No, sir, he was not. He was sexually assaulted by a lot of other inmates and abused, and it kind of just seems like, you know, he's an adult now, but it's very reminiscent of his life in that children's home. After about 9 years in prison, it's 1972 now, Franklin is released and he is sent to go live in a halfway house. He only lasts there for about a week before he runs away. And guess what? He approaches a woman at a gas station, forces her into his car, and he sexually assaults her. And he's caught again. He can't even keep track at this point. And like, this guy's not even making it out of prison more than a week before he's reoffending. Like, can't we see the pattern here? Goes back to prison, but convinces a friend of his to post his bail. So his friend posts his bail, Franklin gets out of prison, but he fails to show up to his court date on June 11th, 1973. So a warrant is issued for his arrest, and he is officially a fugitive. But Franklin's gotten a little bit smarter, you know, after like 700 failed attempts to escape, you keep going back to prison, you finally learn a thing or two. So he's learned that he's not going to go under the name Franklin Floyd anymore. No, he's going to create an alias. So now he's going under the name Brandon Williams. There are a lot of aliases throughout this story, so chronologically I'll tell you what alias these people are going by, but For the entirety of the story, I'm going to refer to him as Franklin because it will just get confusing if I start to use their aliases. In 1974, he meets a woman named Sandy Chipman at a gas station. Somebody please ban this man from all gas stations. Sandy was a mother of 4 young children. They were Suzanne, Allison, Amy, and Philip. Suzanne was the oldest at 4 years old, and so she had 4 children, 4 years and younger. And I guess Franklin just swept her off her feet because they only dated for about a month, and he convinced her and the kids to move with him to Texas and to get married to him. Of course, Sandy had no idea that he was a fugitive. She thought this was Brandon Williams and he was some great guy. By 1975, Sandy was sentenced to serve 30 days in jail for writing bad checks. So she went away for 30 days, and she would have no idea that those 30 days would completely change her life. As soon as she got out of jail, she goes back home and she is greeted by a completely abandoned house. Franklin has left and taken everything, including the children. Eventually, she found Amy and Allison, but she could not find Suzanne anywhere or little Philip. And she tried to file a police report, but the cops basically said that their hands were tied because the kids were taken by their stepfather, and to the cops there was nothing really that they could do, which is a whole nother issue. I understand parental rights and things like that, but abductions happen within families, and some family members are very dangerous and very toxic, and I think that needs to be taken much more seriously. Of course, this was in the 70s. Things have changed a little bit, but I think we could still learn a valuable lesson from this. As we'll learn here in a second, Franklin kidnapped Suzanne so he could have her all for himself, but Philip's whereabouts were still unknown at this time. In 1975, Floyd and Suzanne left Texas and moved up to Oklahoma. He enrolled Suzanne in elementary school, and he was still using her name. She was still going as Suzanne, but he had a different alias at this point. His name was Trenton Davis. This part of the story is a little fuzzy for me, I think because they were moving around so much. Franklin was pulling Suzanne out of schools, putting her into new ones. They were moving to all different states across the country, different cities. They had different aliases in every single place. While we don't know the exact details of what was happening in those years, we do know for certain that Franklin was sexually abusing and grooming Suzanne to one day become his wife. This guy's just such a creep. Like, this was supposed to be her stepfather. It is kind of her stepfather. I don't know legally if he actually is because he didn't use his real name when he got married, so who knows. She knows this man as her father figure. By 1984, the two were residing in Clayton County, Georgia, and Suzanne was now going under the alias Sharon Marshall. She was enrolled in high school there. And somehow, despite all of the terrible, horrible things that she had been through, she was absolutely thriving in school. People remember her being bubbly, popular, outgoing. She was extremely intelligent. She had dreams of becoming an aerospace engineer and working for NASA. So that just goes to show you how smart she was. Actually ended up getting a full scholarship to Georgia Tech, but would end up declining that scholarship. I doubt it was of her own volition. I'm sure Franklin did not like the idea of her going off to college without him. Suzanne was very liked at school, but outside of school she wasn't really allowed to have a social life. One of her friends remembers calling Suzanne's house phone at one point, and Franklin was extremely irate that anybody had their phone number. Her friends just thought that she had a really strict dad, and they could not have possibly imagined the things that were going on inside of that home. Suzanne graduated high school in 1986, but like I said earlier, she was not allowed to attend college. And also at this point, Suzanne had become pregnant by a fellow classmate, and as you can imagine, this completely enraged Franklin. So he was done with their life in Georgia. He made them pack up and they moved on to Florida. Suzanne gave birth to a baby boy that was put up for adoption. His identity is unknown for good reason, but it is said that he did go to a good home. And then by 1988, Suzanne was pregnant again with another baby boy. She named this baby boy Michael, and they decided they would keep him. And I know what you're thinking, but it's not Franklin's baby. Thank God. She's now a newly young mother. Franklin has ruined all of her dreams of working for NASA one day in the future, or even going to college and living a normal life like an 18-year-old. With all of her dreams out the window, Franklin basically forces her to start working as an exotic dancer, and he would hoard all of her income. It's also said that her coworkers remember him coming around the club, and he would sit there and watch her dance and talk about how hot she was. I just hate it. I hate it so much. Like, people think that this is her dad. Obviously, we know that it's not, but they pass their relationship off to everyone as biological father and daughter. And so that's what all of these people at the club think. And he's going up there talking about how attractive she is. It's incredibly disturbing. While she was working at the club, she befriended another young girl named Cheryl Ann Comesso. Growing up, Cheryl sang in the choir, competed in pageants, and she danced, so she really enjoyed that spotlight energy, and she had dreams of going out to Hollywood to become a star. Franklin convinced her that he had connections out in Hollywood because he's a sociopath. Obviously, nobody in Hollywood is associated with you, Franklin. He tried to make some sexual advances towards Cheryl, and she rejected him. And very soon after that, Cheryl mysteriously went missing, and around that same time, Franklin and Suzanne left town. And this time, they were off to New Orleans to get married. Disgusting. I'm sure you can guess. They moved to a new city, they have different aliases, so Franklin is now going under the name Clarence Hughes, and Suzanne is Tanya Tadlock, but once she marries Clarence Hughes, or Franklin. Once she marries him, she then becomes Tanya Hughes. After the wedding, they moved back to Oklahoma and settled in Tulsa. Suzanne started working at another bar there, Exotic Dancing. Her co-workers there said that they all adored her, but they absolutely despised her controlling husband. And Suzanne wanted so badly to flee her life of captivity and take Michael away from all of it, but she knew Franklin would stop at nothing to keep her forever. And on the night of April 25th, 1990, Suzanne was out late walking to the grocery store, trying to get some last minute items for the house. She was listening to some music, just walking along, when out of nowhere she's hit by a car and left for dead. Thankfully, some passerbys saw her and came to her aid and took her to the hospital, but once they got there wasn't really much that could be done for Suzanne. Floyd arrived soon after to see his wife, but he displayed very little emotion, and Suzanne would actually pass away about 5 days later at the age of 20 years old. 20 years old, and she had lived through so much trauma. Like, it feels like she's already been alive a full lifetime based on the things that she's been through. Floyd didn't want to have any kind of service for her, so her co-workers at the bar that she worked at pulled together and paid for her to have a proper funeral service. I think speaks so much to the character that Suzanne had, because she had only been working at that bar for about a year. She clearly made an impact on all of her co-workers, enough for them to band together and hold a proper service for her. There was nothing definitive to link Frank to Suzanne's death, although the doctors that worked on Suzanne did think that her injuries were not really consistent with being struck by a car. But other than that, there wasn't really anything to link him. There was no eyewitnesses or anything present. But they did take Franklin's fingerprints as part of the investigatory process. And when they did, they learned that Clarence Hughes was actually Franklin Floyd. And he had a long criminal history, including an arrest warrant that's been out since 1973. And it's now 1990. But the cops were too late in finding this information out because Floyd had already fled Oklahoma and abandoned Michael there. He was adopted, by the way, just so everybody knows. Floyd had fled back to Georgia, but it wouldn't be too long before the cops caught up with him and arrested him because of that 1973 warrant that he had out. He was arrested and imprisoned for about 33 months, but unfortunately his reign of terror was not over. He was released in 1994 and made his way back to Oklahoma, and he was determined to get Michael back. And like, you literally left him there like almost 3 years ago, and now suddenly you care about him? He's doing fine without you. Don't worry about Michael. He had a great family. I feel like I keep jumping back and forth between using Franklin and Floyd. For some reason I wrote it both ways in my notes, but I think we're all smart enough here to know that his name is Franklin Floyd, so I'm talking about Franklin Floyd, but just wanted to clarify that. So Franklin, back in Oklahoma, does some research. He finds the school that Michael is going to, and Michael is 6 years old at this time, in first grade. Floyd finds the school that Michael is attending. He shows up there with a gun, claiming to be Michael's father, and forces the principal at gunpoint to go get Michael out of his first grade classroom. Not wanting to risk the lives of anyone else and the other children, the principal complies. I feel like maybe there could have been a better way to handle that, but in the moment, I could kind of understand where the principal's head was at. Floyd kidnaps Michael and the principal, in the principal's car, drives the principal out to the woods and ties him to a tree. He's alive and he ends up being safe, but he leaves him there, takes the principal's truck and Michael, and flees. Police search for Franklin for weeks before finally finding him in Kentucky, but Michael was not with him. Franklin was charged with kidnapping and he was arrested again. Around this same time, back in Florida, a man is doing some work on his land when he comes across some human remains. So he calls the cops immediately. Unfortunately, the cops in Florida were not having much luck identifying these remains, but if you'll remember from the very beginning of the story, that stack of photos that mechanic found back in Texas, those would end up being the missing puzzle piece for the cops in Texas and in Florida. It would take a little while, but eventually they were able to piece everything together, that the woman in those photos, remember I mentioned there was a woman who appeared to be dead in some of the photos. They would eventually reveal that the person in those photos was Cheryl Ann Comesso, and she matched the human remains that were found on that man's land. Amongst those photos were dozens of photos of Suzanne posed in sexually explicit positions as young as 4 years old. Because Suzanne died as Tanya Hughes, it took them a little while to put the two pieces together. They were wondering who this little girl was in these photos, but had no idea that Tanya Hughes and Susan were the same person. So it was a little challenging for them to identify the young girl in these photos, but eventually they did realize that Tanya Hughes was Suzanne Marie Savakis, and she was the little girl in the photos who had been held captive by Franklin Floyd for 16 years of her life. With all of this new information and evidence, the police were finally able to charge Franklin Floyd with first-degree murder and kidnapping. His trial began in 2002, and it only took the jury 4 hours to deliberate, and they came back with a guilty verdict. Floyd is now 79 years old and sits on death row in Union Correctional in Florida. In a lot of cases, most cases actually, I am generally against the death penalty. I would rather the perpetrator just sit and rot in prison for the rest of their life, but there's just something about this case that just makes me want Franklin Floyd off of this earth. Like, this world is too good for him and he needs to GTFO. For years, Franklin would not say what happened to Michael, but in a 2015 interview with the FBI, he did reveal that he abducted Michael and shot him in the back of the head twice and dumped his body. Sadly, they have never been able to recover Michael's body, so I guess we don't know for sure that Franklin was telling the truth, but at this point it's really all we have to go off of. Floyd has also never admitted to having anything to do with Suzanne's death, and no other leads have been formed. I mean, I think we can all pretty much assume that Franklin probably had something to do with Suzanne's death, and while she did live a tragic life and was met with a tragic end, at least she could finally be free of her captor. I hope one day we're able to forget Franklin Floyd's name, but I hope we never forget Suzanne Marie Savakis, Cheryl Ann Comesso, and Michael Anthony Hughes. All three deserved so much more from this life. And that is it, you guys. That is the absolutely horrible, horrible case of Franklin Delano Floyd and his many crimes. There is a Netflix documentary about this case coming out on July 6th, I believe, so keep an eye out for that. I know I'll be watching it. And I made pasta. I'm very excited about it. Per usual, if it's good, recipe will be linked down below. And if you want to see more of the true crime dish, don't forget to like and subscribe. And I'll see you guys very soon in a new video. Bye guys.